Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Jasper Snyder. I'm the EVP of Cross-Platform Media here at the AIRP. Welcome to the Cross-Platform Deep Dive. We have two fantastic presentations for you today from two of the rock stars of the industry, Taylor Schneider and Schneider brother from Tubodal, and Ross Winton, Sir Ross Winton, almost recently knighted by the Queen just a couple of weeks ago. He can tell you that story, I dare say. I just want to set the scene before we go into those presentations, just to recap the opportunity of cross-platform advertising. And this is, for those of you who haven't seen this, is a brief reprise of the How Advertising Works research that we announced, unveiled at Rethink this year. So basically setting the scene for the research, we know that advertising works. We've known it for decades now. Some famous work in the JAR, a number of other stages. And one of the key presentations there is the original How Advertising Works study, which was based on behavior scan data from 1989, showing definitively that advertising worked and also quantifying the long-term impact of advertising. The question for today is, how does cross-platform advertising work? And there's a great body of work on the effectiveness of individual channels, but there's less work around how those channels work together. And there are two kind of hurdles that we had to overcome. One is that the existing body of work, where it's cross-category, it's not necessarily cross-platform. There might be a bunch of different verticals and categories, but it might be focused just on digital. Conversely, the stuff that's cross-platform isn't necessarily cross-category. You might have stuff with a bunch of platforms, but it's just focused on soup or carbonated soft drinks or cereal or what have you. So that was the challenge to us, was to define ground truths for the industry in terms of how advertising works, that were cross-platform and cross-category. So our mantra is collaborate, invest, and do. We got together a whole bunch of industry leaders in February of last year and said, okay, we're revisiting how advertising works. One of the key issues at the center of that. We invested a whole bunch of money and time and resource in 3 experiments. Thank you also for the support of all the various partners involved in here too. And what we did was to the ground truth at scale effectively. We looked at 5,000 campaigns, $375 billion in ad spend across 100 countries, 1,000 brands and so on. So very, very wide scale. And we established 5 ground truths. I'm just going to walk you through them. The first one is basically an answer to the question of, should I move money from one platform to another platform, or should I invest in multiple platforms? And the ground truth is this: advertising across platforms delivers higher ROI. So the average 2-platform campaign is 19% more effective than the average single platform campaign. The average 5-platform campaign is 35% more effective than the average single platform campaign. So more is better, basically speaking. And yet, when you look at the numbers of campaigns, or the percentages of campaigns that take place on those numbers of campaigns, you can see that 60%. 60% of campaigns are on 2 platforms or fewer. So big opportunity, we think, for the advertising industry. Second ground truth is around combinations of media. So one of the questions we get asked a lot is, okay, what are the magical combinations? So we looked at print and TV, and these are indexed here, so we can see that the average print and TV campaign 19% more effective than the average TV only campaign. Hi, question.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Sure.
I had a question about that.
Go for it.
Sorry. Is that segmented by age or audience, the different ones?
Broad brushstrokes. Sure. So are there any magical combinations of media? Yes, there are. Print and TV is 90% more effective than TV only. Print, obviously, unique attributes, not least its tactile nature. Radio and TV, 20% more effective than the average TV-only campaign. Radio obviously has the advantage of purchase location being right nearby. Yet when you look at digital and TV, 60% more effective than a TV-only campaign. In fact, a stat came out, I think it was this morning or yesterday, in either Adweek or AdAge or whatever, one of those big trades, talking about the amount of the number of Olympic advertisers who are using both those platforms. And I think it was 482 were using TV. I forget what the figure was. 95%, a really substantial percentage of those were using TV in tandem, which is perhaps in contrast to the figure we saw on the previous slide down here. Third ground truth we established is that, perhaps a little unexpectedly, when you look at millennials, the blend of traditional and digital media is not as wide as you might, widely divergent as you might have thought from the all adults group. So for adults, basically, 78% traditional is an optimal mix with 22 in digital. So traditional obviously is TV, radio, and print here. And yet when you look at 18 to 34-year-olds, granted, there's a lot of differences in there. The 18-year-old unmarried person, very different to a 34-year-old married with 3 kids. But nevertheless, within that demographic, you see all the headlines about millennials not using TV, radio, print, and whatever, and just using mobile. So you might have expected that column chart to be flipped over, but it's not. So traditional media is super important still for all demographics. The fourth ground truth that we established is around digital. Whole bunch of data. For all of you that are ARF members, by the way, this is just, these are 5 slides or 6 slides from, 20, 30, 40 page deck. So if you want more stuff, ping me and I'll share it with you. But one of the key pieces of, can you have a key piece of low-hanging fruit? I'm not sure. Anyway, a piece of low-hanging fruit, we think for the advertiser and the industry, in general, is to focus on frequency. We know that an awful lot of impressions in digital, for example, are superfluous, when in fact they can actually cause harm to your campaign. Basically, the breakpoint is around about here. If you're delivering more than 35 impressions in a month, basically 1 per day, you are at risk of harming your campaign. It's actually worse than having no advertising. And yet, when you look at the numbers of impressions that are delivered, you can see that there are very, very significant percentages of campaigns that are delivering 50, 60, 70, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the fourth ground truth. Pay attention to frequency. And then the fifth piece was around about creative. So we know that cross-platform advertising pays these great dividends. There's 19% for the 2-platform campaign, the 35 for the 5-platform campaigns. The question is, what's my creative strategy in that context? Should I produce different kinds of creative, completely different executions for TV and digital? Should I have exactly the same content, or should I have some kind of blend? This is and we know how important creative is. So the finding is this: a consistent, unified strategy delivers the strongest results. And let me unpack that jargon for a second. Apologies, we couldn't find a better word than unified. But what we mean by this is if you compare a campaign which is non-unified, i.e. likely produced by 2 different agencies, one for digital and one for TV, then it underperforms a campaign which is produced together, which is holistically designed, by 57%. So a unified campaign is one where you're taking linked creative, so it might have the same characters, the same messaging, the same colors, the same music, and you're customizing it for each individual platform. 57% more effective than a non-unified strategy. Raises the question, okay, how do I customize for each individual platform? And as luck would have it, one of our new research projects, I think, which is now a work in progress, is, okay, how do I customize for mobile? So check back in a month or 6 weeks or so, and we'll have much more detail around that.
So that's your calendars for September 22nd. At the end, we're going to tell you that we're having a big event.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. So those are the 5 ground truths. As I said, we've got a ton more data, loads more slides, category views, demographic views for that question a second ago that we're happy to share with you. Just to sum up, more is better. Invest in multiple platforms. Combine traditional with digital for all demographics. Maximize return on digital by optimizing frequency. We also have some really interesting findings, by the way, on video versus display and mobile versus desktop. And then create a unified strategy for creative across platforms. We think the opportunity is huge. $196 billion are spent in advertising in this country, predicted to be this year. We think if advertisers were to optimize that, particularly in terms of the amount of platforms they're investing in, they could create an effective $31 billion additionally. So, it's a huge, we think cross-platform advertising is a huge opportunity, and these are the kind of strategic, or the broad brushstrokes, as I said, the big picture, if you will. One thing which I think we're honored to have with us today is 2 guys who are really taking this down to how do I practically execute that. So without further ado, let me introduce Taylor Schreiner, who's the VP of Research at TubeMogul, who's going to talk to us around cross-screen planning and taking these findings into a very practical sphere.
Thanks, Jasper. That was a great, thank you very much. Thank you for that research. I think, part of what we did at TubeMogul has a lot to do with the fact that Jasper did the work that he did in the ARF, has done the work that it has done, and open up these questions that we're all faced around in this increasingly cross-screen, cross-channel world where people are using all sorts of different media at different times of day in different ways and finding new mediums literally on a quarter by quarter, year by year basis. How do we adapt to that? How do we fulfill the recommendations that Jasper and the ARF team have laid out there? So that's the research we're going to look at. A little bit of that here today. But again, thank you, Jasper. Thanks to the ARF for having us. Thanks for all for being here, and Reality Mind for helping put this together. Specifically, what I want to look at today is we're going to talk a little bit, very, very briefly, about cross-screen planning and how it fits into sort of the ideas that Jasper laid out earlier. I'm going to go relatively briefly through that because Jasper did such a great job of setting up the challenges that we face as an industry. And then talk a little bit about algorithmic planning, meaning taking these results and these findings that we've got that we're looking to reach across multiple platforms, and how do we use algorithms, or specifically in this case, one algorithm, to optimize for that. And then the meat of this will be talking about what can an algorithm do to make your planning better, and what does that really mean in terms of numbers that can make a difference to your business. And then very briefly, I will entertain my own ego by talking about where does this all go, and what do we all do with this information, where does the research go? Assuming there's time. My ego gets cut if there's not time. Not 45 minutes, more like 25 minutes. So Jasper did a great setup. Just to sort of reinforce what we're talking about here, we're talking about a world in which, you know, as recently as 50 years ago or 40 years ago, you're getting one or two new media every couple of years, and you've got these cool little curves of how they're getting adopted. And now, you know, we're getting blown away by Snapchat, Pinterest, Twitter, you know, Pandora and Spotify, and new and interesting things are coming along all the time. And frankly, it's now, this presents a couple challenges. One is, obviously, consumption is now fractured across a number of screens, or a number of channels, however you want to define that term. In addition, that fractured nature is changing all the time. So there are new entrants in terms of media that people are using. There are some that are exiting, and so people are changing behavior all the time. On top of that, you know, we're finding that people are not behaving the way we would want them to, which is to understand what demographic they belong to and consume their media in a consistent way with everybody else who belongs to that same demographic. Instead, they have the gall to be using the mediums that they find interesting at the times that they want to use them, and having diverse sets of consumption behaviors. So this poses a real problem. It basically means that even if you solve for cross-screen, if you optimize your plan for reaching across screens and do everything the ARF is asking you to do, tomorrow that world is going to change, or you're going to be looking at a different audience, or something's going to be different, and you're going to have to adapt. So this got us thinking about how can an algorithm help us plan in this environment, plan across screens. Now, let me take a slight digression for a moment and talk about what I mean by cross-screen planning. What I mean here is this is a TV example. It is just an example. Don't get too attached to the numbers. But, you know, imagine a world in which you've made a TV buy, or a digital buy. Let's just call it one channel. I'm going to call it TV because it's easy, but frankly, this applies to any given channel. You're going to find that the top 20% of people who use that channel, that TV, they consume a lot. You're going to get a lot of frequency against them, and you're going to probably get more than whatever effective frequency you think you need is. And then as you go out down these quintiles, you're going to find that the people who use less and less of that channel, you're going to get fewer and fewer of them. You're going to get less and less overall reach. I think that might be in 3D, the 61%, but I hope everybody can read that, the slight doubling there. So you get less and less reach as you go out in these quintiles, and you get below optimal frequency. If you plan across channels, you allocate some of that spend to other places where you can reach these people in the second quintile with other things like, say, for instance, programmatic television or online video or mobile video, and you build a plan that goes out and finds the people who are not reached by your initial buy, but who you want to reach anyway. And this keeps your average frequency closer to where you want it to be, and it expands your reach. This is something this has been going on. I mean, you know, Rex Briggs has been talking about shifting these you know, between channels since I think 2002. This isn't this piece isn't revelatory. What is a revelation is that we're not just talking about TV and digital as sort of a simple split now. What we're talking about is, television, programmatic television, video on demand, online video, mobile, and social as well now as we talk down the chain. And this is a moment for me to remember that I should introduce myself. So, as we talk about these things, I've gotten all excited about what we're doing, but I work for TubeMogul. How many people know who TubeMogul is? Okay, good. So I don't feel too badly about not introducing myself, but one of the reasons we got interested in all this is we came up over here in this online video space, and we said, we will help you find the right place to place your video. We will be transparent about the way we deliver it. We'll be all excited about it, and we'll pitch you on our value proposition. But what increasingly has become part of our business is to be out over here in television and in mobile, and we're realizing very rapidly that as we help our clients, we have to help them understand how do they buy across these multiple platforms. And being a software company as we are, we thought, let's talk about algorithms and how they do those things. So what we built, and the reason this research exists is that there was a tool built that I got to play with. The tool looks like this. The tool is what we call, any computer science majors in the room? Okay, no. So we'll call it, it's a greedy algorithm. That'll mean nothing to anybody. What it does is it basically says, look, I'm going to take your buy, whatever you tell me you already bought. I'm going to go work with the Nielsen Fusion panel and some of our and TubeMogul's pricing data that we get from the way that we buy things across across the various screens. And I'm going to go look for, I'm going to look at all I'm going to put prices on everything I could buy. And also, I'm going to do that in terms of on-target CPM. So what does it cost me to get people I haven't reached yet? And I'm going to rank that. I'm going to find the cheapest way for me to get more people I haven't reached yet who are in my target. I'm going to add that thing, whatever the cheapest choice is, right? So I'm going to say I started with this, and I'm going to find the cheapest way to get a couple more. So making this a little more practical, I'm looking at millennial men, right? I started here, I had this plan, I looked for the next way to get more millennial men I haven't otherwise reached. I add something, home and garden TV, you'd be surprised how many millennial men are watching HGTV. I've interviewed them in Kansas City, you'd be surprised. And you add that to the plan, now this becomes your new plan, and you go back through the process 1,000 times and you figure out what's the cheapest way for me to get as much reach as I can. There are other things you might want to do here. There's a longer discussion about maybe you want optimal frequency of 4, maybe you want to do other things, maybe you want to weight your digital less than your mobile. Given the time, I'm going to put that to one side and just say, look, what we did here was look at how do you get the most reach across screens with an algorithm like this. I can talk, anybody's got questions, happy to talk to you guys after about this. That led us to a question. How good is this algorithm at planning? Or more to the point, is this kind of algorithm really the future? Is this the way we need to be going? What's this going to mean for our industry? And how different is this than what you've got, a couple stats master's degrees sitting around with a spreadsheet trying to do something similar? So what we did was we said, look, we're going to compare two things. We're going to build what we call a siloed plan, meaning we're going to take an average buy across the channels that we look at. Pardon me. The channels here that we're looking at are TV, digital video, mobile video. We simplified for the purposes of this research. And we're going to take the average distribution of budget according to eMarketer, right? So we're going to say, look, we're going to imagine that people are buying the way that your average advertiser buys. Now, averages are obviously averages, and they have challenges. We'll talk about that in a minute. But your average advertiser spends 88% of their money on TV, 7% of their money on digital video, and 5% on mobile video within the video space, right? And then we're going to have the software imagine that it's doing the job of 3 different departments: the TV department, the digital video department, the mobile department, building separate plans and shoving those things together, as many companies do, right? As they separate their budgets and have the planning process happen separately. And we're not, just because it's simpler, we're not going to say you already bought American Idol or college football or any of that. We're going to set that to one side for the moment. We're just going to build it from scratch. And then we're going to compare that to an algorithm where we take the same budget. Sorry, I didn't mention this, $10 million. Software determines the budget allocation by by channel, and software plans across the channels, and again, no base plan. And so we gave them both $10 million, and we did this across numerous audiences. We gave them both $10 million, said, how many people can you find for that $10 million in a quarter, by the way? The answer is, so if you look across, we did this for a number of different groups, and the answer is, in dark green, the algorithm, a lot more than in light green, the siloed plan. Like a lot more, like more than I anticipated, a lot more. So for instance, over here, you're looking at, just to help you read this, because I don't think this is super clear. In the dark green, you've got what the cross-screen planner has done with that 10 million, and it has found almost 88 million adults 18 to 49. The siloed plan, meaning the sort of representation of how an average siloed company might build a media plan, is reaching more like 44 million, 43.5 million people. And depending on who you're reaching, like these people are expensive, the men 18 to 34 are expensive and harder to get. We tried this out with a bunch of demographics. We looked at some life stage pieces, and we looked at some intent as well, and said, how does this play out in different scenarios? And there's more than this in the white paper, and blah blah blah. We'll guide you to that. But what it comes down to is that you get these kinds of situations where you're spending, if you're building a siloed plan, the way that a human would sit in front of this and build a plan, you're spending maybe $1.40 to reach a millennial male, and the algorithm is spending more like 50 cents. And that's pretty huge. That's the biggest example. I mean, for adults 18 to 49, it's less dramatic, but that's the biggest example. In fact, maybe it's better represented this way, where we're saying, look, you're spending almost 3 times as much when you're doing this manually, or as we emulate doing it manually, in the men 18 to 34, the millennial males, versus what you're going to get out of an algorithm. Now, and so, but there's also a lot of variance here, right? So like in this case, millennial males are very, very expensive relative to the planner. Auto intenders, more expensive, but not dramatically more expensive. I mean, or 50% is pretty big, or it would be if you weren't bringing it to 185%. So there's also a lot of variation in the way these groups were priced. And we can talk a little bit about that. So that brought up a question for us, which is, okay, so if these different groups are so different in terms of how much better the algorithm performs than a person, why might that be? And this is going to lead to my questions about where do we go with this research, but we have some inkling, right? So, and some of that inkling comes from another cut that we did. We went in and said, let's do this whole process again, but let's do it for household income, right? And so, this is sort of the inverse of the previous graph, and I apologize for that, but this is basically saying, the difference between the algorithmic and manual process when you're shopping for people who are, under 50K, you try to reach them. It's big, it's 30%, but it's not nearly as big as when you're trying to reach people of 150K plus in the sort of 50% range. And we kind of wondered why that is, and this has led us to sort of the next stage of this research, where we say, look, part of this is because the way that people who earn under 50K consume media looks an awful lot like that eMarketer budget, right? So there's a macro impact there. Whereas the people who make 150, 200K plus are much more likely to be spending their time on desktop video or on mobile video. So what this is saying is that when you spend that sort of average, part of what's going on is the average budget is sort of media mix issue, right? The average budget that you're buying, really works with this group, whereas it doesn't really work with this group. And that's sort of the next stage of this question is, how much of this is about the media mix, and how much of this is about picking the right TV shows, mobile apps, social channels, digital video to add up to the right group of people with the minimum amount of duplication. And we're working on that. Just to give a hint at that real quickly, it says something to me that, where as you start to deviate from the average mix, you start to go up from 29%, but this seems to be the bottom. It seems to be that about 30%, there's a lot of caveats to what I'm about to say, which I'll skim over, but it seems to be about 30% of the value of algorithmic planning has to do with getting in there and picking those individual, having the algorithm pick those individual sites in the manner we showed earlier, as opposed to just the macro media mix pieces of it. And so expect to see more from us on that front. And I think I've covered most of my ego on this, but I love this piece of research because it doesn't answer everybody's questions. It starts to open up some of the questions that Jasper has opened up about how do we do all these things? How do we reach people in an optimal way with algorithms? How can we build on that? And so we've got a lot more to do about reaching optimal frequency, about looking at different audiences, and I'm eager to come back in front of this audience and others and talk to you guys about it some more as we develop that. Thank you. I think we're good on. I think we're over on time. Oh, question.
I just wonder who your audience.
Oh, so we have a number. So really briefly, because we're talking about the business. We do a lot of brand direct work where brands were coming and work with us. We do a lot where agencies are working through us as a sort of trade desk, and we have a number of other models where brand says work with TubeMogul, or brand and agency agree to work with TubeMogul, and agency does the implementation through us.
How does what you're advertising affect the algorithm? Like if you're advertising something that everybody buys, like cereal or laundry detergent.
It's a good question. So
versus like a Rolex watch or something.
Right.
Somebody under 50K, it's not.
Right. So what the algorithm does is it says it doesn't take that into account. That's probably a layer further. What it does allow you to say is, I want to advertise cereal. Let me make sure I find all the cereal buyers, and it can take the MRI data set and say, I want you to find high frequency cereal buying households and make sure I get optimal reach within those. Or I don't know if you can get to Rolex watches. Luxury items, yeah, exactly. So that would be the way you would define the audience that way, and then do that. And again, this is all for sort of maximum reach. You might want to push your reach up to maximize against an effective frequency that is greater than 1. Yeah, sure.
2 questions on the kind of data that you can work with. So maybe it'd be helpful we talked about this before, but maybe
sure.
The different data inputs you're using. But there's 2 data sets I'm curious about. How do you think about incorporating? One is, how do you figure out really when is the right time to reach people? Because this is about how to reach them, but not about when to reach them.
Right.
So you don't have. How do you think about the context for people when they're going to be most receptive to a message, and figuring out how to optimize for that? And how do you also think about how to adapt the plan in terms of the creative? Because obviously the creative is a big factor, which isn't about just the media that we're exposed to. So,
right. No, those are really good questions, and they really point to what we did here, which is we said, look, this is a huge question, right? Yeah. The creative, what are you selling? How frequent do you want to be? When are people receptive? Those are all layers of complexity that are really hard to integrate into this. So we said, look, the short answer is going to be we ignored all that.
Right.
We said, whatever. We basically said, look, if somebody's watching TV at 2 in the morning, they're as receptive to my Rolex watch ad as they are at work at noon, or as they are on their commute on their mobile phone. And that's obviously not true. And it's also not true that for any given creative, your desktop video is as effective as your mobile video. But how those work, how those integrate is a sort of an overlay to this. So the idea is get this right, figure this piece out, and then overlay some of those other pieces and say, look, are we going to discount everything that happens between 10 and 4 in the morning because we don't believe that to be an effective time? Are we going to increase mobile's effectiveness because we think that full screen experience of video on mobile is more effective than anything else? You can start to layer those pieces on. This doesn't do that.
You talking about the incredible audiences that you found in the user algorithm. Can you confirm those are actually unique cookies, households, mobile IDs, or is it those potential big requests?
Those are unique people, unique individuals.
Is there an overlap between different?
Oh, you mean between? Sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding the question. Were all of these people in this group, or sorry, maybe easier to put over here, like all the light greens were also found by the dark greens?
Yeah, and also how many of them were first-time home buyers that are also adults?
Oh, so good question. We did each of these things very, very separately. So we basically ran through the whole process for home buyers, ignoring everything else. That's a fair question, and we got some stuff on that. Stay tuned. The overlap, I can't actually confirm. In fact, I would be surprised if absolutely everybody in the siloed plan was reached in every case by the algorithm, because the algorithm's looking for those really cheap opportunities to find more people, and it may therefore forsake some things that you might otherwise think you might want to buy. So they're probably, but it's pretty marginal, the difference.
Are you collecting any data on the responsiveness by media outlets? I'm just imagining like PC Magazine might be better for computers and car and driver for automobiles. Maybe with your relationship with Nielsen, are they providing you any information that can be used to assess the responsiveness of a car?
I think the answer is yes, and we're not done with it. We haven't published it yet. So we're getting there. It's not part of this, but yes, we're definitely working on that piece this year. It's probably not satisfying, but it'll come. Pardon me.
All right.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Another star of the industry, Ralph Swinton, Chief Reality Miner at that's 5 or 6 slides. Chief Reality Miner at Reality Mine. Great.
It's always tough being between now and the drinks, but I will do my best to earn the drink here. What I'm going to talk about is really building on both what Jasper Taylor had to say. In fact, in a way, what we're doing at Reality Mine is providing the data inputs that are helping fuel ultimately better ways on figuring out how to place advertising, where to place it, and ultimately how to make better advertising decisions. We're really at the coal mine of how do you actually get data to describe what people are actually doing? How are they consuming media? How do they go about their daily lives? So you can actually understand when people are going to be most receptive to advertising, how to best reach them, when, where, who should they be with, how should they be feeling? And how do you quantify that? And how do you use technology to really build that picture out? We think fundamentally, yes, you can take a whole pile of data sets and smoosh them all together and try to make up stuff by fusing away. But we think there's a way to start where if you can actually start with the truth of actually understanding what a person does, you get enough of those people, you can then start creating a lot more value by taking some of these amazing, beautiful, huge, massive, big data sets and combining them. You start to get a more detailed picture. So what I want to just talk about for now then is really, we talk about cross-media and cross-media measurement. What does it actually mean? And I'll give you a little bit of data about what we think about and show you how we actually go about making the factory to produce cross-media data and behavioral data. So I just want to explain, what is it that actually, when we talk about what's an audience, what do we mean? How do you actually figure out the source of viewership? How do you actually measure this stuff? You can understand that. How do we actually figure out what the behavior and the consumption behavior of someone is? And to give you a sense of just on how that varies too, and how you have to measure things differently to figure out actually what they're doing. So hopefully by the end of this, you understand a little bit of actually how you go to produce data that then someone else can take and actually start to build some algorithms on to actually figure out how you should plan, ultimately drive these decisions that we know you have to be marketing cross-platform. But this is really down the coal face. How do you actually have some data you can believe in on which to do all this work? So let me try to do that. And ultimately, why does this matter to even get this? Well, just to give you some data, nothing shocking here, but amazingly, people are watching less linear TV, listening to radio less. They're definitely on their computers more. They're on their phones more. They're about the same with games. There's less print being consumed, more tablets. These are things you expect, but actually these shifts are pretty significant considering relatively short period of time. And you see very different shifts between millennials and older, shifts all across the board. And those shifts are what drive, how do you actually understand those shifts? How do you measure them? How do you act on them? And as the point's been made a couple of times already this evening, these are changing in all sorts of ways, in very subtle ways. And I love Taylor's slide. There was little change in from 30 years to 3 years. Well, this is actually those little fluctuations. We can break all these and see many, many, many kinds of changes going on by very specific platforms within those. When you think about it, it's not only on total media by media type. It's also about cross-platform, multi-things. So what are you doing together? How is it changing in terms of people using their computer and mobile, or TV and mobile, or TV and computer? And on we go. So the nature of how people are using media simultaneously or in combinations themselves are changing. So this gets to understand just two things in combination. Already we see shifts in these kinds of behaviors. To think about this statically is impossible. Or if it's possible, it'd just be flawed. So you have to think this is a very dynamic environment where people's behaviors are changing. They're changing, as we're seeing, at a crazy rate. So it's important to actually measure and understand that. And we see, again, just on TV itself, how is the nature of consuming TV? We all know this. I'm sure everybody in this room is subscribing to some sort of over-the-top platform, if not multiple ones. So how are you consuming that? The Olympics itself, massive shift in viewing behavior. You know, yes, okay, the top line audiences seem to be down. Actually, you look at aggregate, the numbers are actually very huge. 1.5 billion minutes of television streamed as of beginning of the week. The enormous amount of data, and that's just in the US. And why does this all matter? Because in fact, you think about what are we trying to do with marketing is drive people ultimately through a path to purchase, but these paths to purchase, as you go through each of these steps, are really different. Forget, we just take different things. These are just for the sake of illustration, right? We could apply different categories to these. These come from some of our data, but it's not even just digital. One of the beautiful things, of course, digital is you can measure it all. Part of the challenge of what we try to do is actually not just measure just the digital, but actually across all the media, because they're all relevant. Whether it's, sure, online, mobile is great, but what about word of mouth? Incredibly powerful media, but you have to measure differently, right? You need different kinds of inputs. How do you measure print? Like newspaper still has a place. Radio, good old-fashioned radio, is important. You need to understand how it fits in, because if you want to drive people to your store to ignore it at your peril. In-store, certainly good old coupon machines still really work. Don't work for everybody. In-store video advertising works brilliantly for millennials. Good old flyers work better for older shoppers. But all these things, it's all part of the mix. Ultimately, how do you drive someone through this path to the end? So you need to be able to get data to understand the whole path and how to figure out how to put it all together. And you see that that path is a function of context. So just to give a little snapshot about why we think context is so important. The plan without context is really missing out. That just, if you look at people's social media behavior just in two different situations, how very different it is. If you're watching TV, we see this is kind of the rank order of how people tend to spend time on their social networks watching TV, right? Twitter and Facebook, and off it goes. Whereas if you're out shopping, Facebook is absolutely crushing it there. So again, very different. Why are they the same thing? Oh, people, what's the penetration of these platforms? It's not the right way to think about it. It's about the context that drives media behavior, which ultimately should be driving your strategy on how to market. So again, this all goes to the mix of how do you understand this? How can you quantify this to drive your plan? And ultimately, it comes down to understanding things which currently are not well understood. We talk about the importance of cross-media, but I can tell you that really there is extremely poor data in the universe right now. You probably all know this, but just as two examples, we're proud to be really pushing at the boundaries of this, and we know how hard it is, but we're currently doing a major project for SIM trying to give the media industry good data about how children consume content across all these platforms today. And the reason that Viacom and Turner and NBC, ABC are all pouring this money in is not because they need more data, it's because they have no data. There's a big black hole in how actually children consume data across platforms, because it's really hard to get. The same where we won this project for NBC, measuring how people consume media across platforms simultaneously, because it's really hard to get. And thank goodness we're actually delivering data. Some of the stuff you'll see will be coming out more. But it's the challenge of how do you use technology to get this data. And that's what I want to explain to you over time, is how you start to put this. And only now are the tools finally starting to come to the point where you can actually start to tell this picture, to paint the picture and get the story. So let me explain to you how you actually go about measuring cross-media behavior. And when we think about this, you could take a household point of view. But ultimately, as we just see in all this data, if you're going to try to reach people across multiple media, we know that's more effective. To think about this at the household level is clearly just missing very important parts, because you're going to not be targeting people in most of the right times of the day. The same where device-centric, well, we've seen lots of data already. That's also bad way to think about it because you're not optimizing. So you really have to think about it from a person out. You got to be able to understand and quantify the total media behavior of a person, their context, what's going on around them. If you don't start from that point of view, you're definitely not going to be planning and targeting and acting a media strategy in the right way. So this is a blueprint for how you actually need to do this. And it's a messy thing. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just talking through this, just so you understand actually what's required in terms of technology and tools to actually quantify someone's cross-media behavior. And this is just the digital behavior. I'm going to talk to you about how you reach beyond the digital behavior in a moment. So this is what we're doing. This is a blueprint of what we're doing for SIM, for measuring children and teens cross-media behavior. But it's a blueprint that can be applied to anyone. We take panelists, obviously. In this case, we're recruiting people in. We're triple opting them in so they know we're capturing, hoovering up all the data they have across all of the devices. In the case, what we found is our average home that we're measuring, where there's parents and at least one child, we're measuring on average 13 devices in the home. Some devices have more than 22, 24, 26 devices that are delivering content to the home and to the people, individuals. And you have to measure all these things, the televisions, OTT devices, so the Rokus, Chromecasts, Apple TVs, game stations are another big source, of course, Nintendos and game stations, PlayStations, whatnot, tablets, laptops, PCs, phones. All of these are delivering content in the home, and also you see some of these things can be carried out of the home. And to measure all these things, we use a bunch of different tools. So we're using, for example, set-top box data, good source, very reliable, but doesn't tell you everything. It tells you what that set-top box is delivering. We use audio content recognition, which is things like Shazam is an example of that, where it's listening and is able to take what audio input comes around the device, listens out, and is able to convert the audio signatures into a database, compare it. Say if there's a match between this signature and the database, okay, you must be watching this thing that we know. We meter all the Wi-Fi activity in the home. So all this digital traffic going through, we take that, we measure that. And we also put bits of software on everyone's devices, on their PCs, on their laptops, on their tablets. And that lets us measure all the apps they're using, the websites they're using, the media they're consuming, all that content. All of that has to come together. You take that all, you have to go and clean it up and figure out, okay, what's actually happening in parallel, what's happening simultaneously, or actually, what are we double counting? If we're picking up that someone's watching a movie on the television through their tablet because of the ACR, how do we actually know what they're watching? So we need to understand the router meter is seeing that there's traffic coming through to the Apple TV. The TV, there's no set-top box data coming at that time, or it's not hitting the glass. We see that there's no actual streaming data coming from the tablet, but we see the ACR data. All of that has to get added up together just to figure out that one person is watching that one show. So imagine this, you're trying to do this for multiple devices happening concurrently throughout the house, and you have to attribute to people. And in fact, we had applied originally just using a good old check-in process, Nielsen, but we actually found that people are terrible at checking in, especially kids. And so we're now implementing a passive recognition system where we can determine just using facial scanning to see who's in front of the televisions or in front of devices. And that's going to help improve the ability to say who exactly is in front of what, to attribute properly the viewership in front of big screens. So all of this, we're able then to filter and finally give you individual viewer behavior. So I'm happy to go through all those pieces in extraordinary detail. I think the point here is that each of these pieces, each and every step is required in order to package up and produce very simply just what is someone watching on TV now? Or how is it someone is watching the Olympics today? How they watched across their day? What have they watched on TV, on their mobile device, the tablet? What were they doing in parallel? How much of that were they watching on Facebook? Which they actually watched on the NBC app or through NBC on TV? To figure that all out, be very precise about that requires just an enormous amount of technology, an enormous amount of analytics. And it is hard and messy work. And it is still far from a perfect thing. But this is the kind of things you have to do to actually be able to paint this whole picture. Just within TV itself, of course, you don't even have just programming, but here we've got promos and commercials as well. And we end up actually having, just to figure out what someone's watching on television, forget any other device. We need to take both the set-top box data, we take audio content recognition, what's coming in from the router meter, and the devices, all of those things together to figure out where is this television program coming from? Is it from live TV? Is it DVR? Is it VOT? Is it being streamed from a device? Which device? How? All of those things all together are required to actually just answer that one simple, which is really important because marketing strategies depend on that. Efficiency of reaching people depends on actually figuring out exactly where that program is coming from and how they're getting it, how they're even choosing it. When it comes to devices, that's a whole other spectrum. So when we think about, okay, we need to be marketing on PCs or tablets or mobile devices as part of the whole mix. Okay, but where, when, what are they actually using? So we put some software in there, but across that, then think of all these different platforms, understanding web behavior, app usage, search, social in the black hole, piles of different things. Never mind media consumption through to the OTT platforms. And each of these requires very specific meters. All of these guys, for example, do their very best to make sure it's impossible to measure what they're actually delivering. So there's a great game of cat and mouse to figure out actually what content you're watching on Hulu or on Netflix or on HBO or Amazon. And the same where, unless you're using something like a router meter to know what people are watching through Xbox, which is an enormous area of growth, for example, for ESPN. Sports media consumption through the ESPN app on a game station is actually a big source of growth. It's growing about 10% month on month. So to be able to measure just that part of the puzzle is very important, and again, hard to get to. So that's the digital part. But then there's still one more piece, which is you can't get everything digitally. And I always think of that, the story about the drunk man looking for his keys where there's light. Well, we can't just be slaves to the digital world because there's more to our lives than the digital experience. In fact, right now, look, everyone is fairly device free. We're looking at one screen here. So we need to be thinking about what's that context and what are other sorts of media? What else is going on around people? And so we use still to complement all of our digital measurement. We use still a good old-fashioned surveys type approach to actually fill in the whole picture. We have a syndicated data offer we call Touchpoints, which runs now in 15 countries around the world, where we ask people to spend a week answering this e-diary on a half-hourly basis, answering 5 basic questions. Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? What media are you consuming? And how do you feel? With this, we generate from an average person hundreds of thousands of data points in one period of very granular, actionable data that provides really the only syndicated view of consumers' daily lives. You can actually think about where really are people? How are they living their lives? And when is the best time to reach them with a message? And is it a digital channel? Is it a broadcast channel? Or is it something else? Is it out of home? Is it print? Is it posters? Is it a cinema ad? All those things you have to think about in a bundle. And when really is someone going to be most receptive? We're also able to get things like word of mouth in here. So again, when we think about cross media, I think it's really important to think about how do you get all these sources of data so you can actually understand really when is the right time to reach someone to best impact their behavior, to change it. Because it's a very fragmented landscape. And even just think about all these devices across the range we're measuring and where you need to do it. So how do you even, to get good data, how do you build a representative sample? So for example, what we're doing for our SIM project is we know we can't just rely on measuring people in major urban centers, that we actually have been measuring families all across the country because there are very different behaviors. People have very different viewing, very different consumption habits as a result of where they are. But when we take all this data, this is how it ends up getting used in the planning process. And this is where, for us, I think it's very interesting. We see what Taylor's up to, and they're start thinking about building algorithmic programming across channel, that it's taking stuff right the way through from being able to use data to start to plan and ideate. How can you better reach people? When is the right time to activate them? How do you have a creative strategy to actually engage them? I think there's such an opportunity there for creative agencies to be using this data to actually better understand their consumer and really think about how to activate them. Because we know they need to be using all these different channels, but are they making enough use of this kind of data to actually plan and inform that creative strategy? I started off my own experience working in a creative agency, my own career, and I never had access to this kind of data. Just think, when you're trying to plan a strategy, how much more effective it could be if you could actually really think about that from the beginning, never mind working right through to execution, implementation. And this is where we're starting to work towards, where not only can we help in the strategy and planning, start planning on the buying, but actually then start looking at efficiency. You can start to see how has the plan worked against against the strategy? Are we actually delivering them? You can start to see real behavior change. Are people going to the stores? Are they spending more time there? Are they searching for these things? Are they buying these things online? Actually, are they going and buying in the supermarket? And it ultimately comes down to these sorts of things where just using this data, being able to look at stuff across platforms is really where we see there's huge value and start to understand cross-media behavior. So what are the challenges, though? And I say this with just so you understand where the barriers lie in getting good cross-media data. The very first challenge we find is how do you actually make sure you get compliant people? This is the most basic research challenge, right? How do you get someone to complete a survey? How do you get someone to keep technology running on their phones? And I'd love to say we have that problem solved as a business. We don't. And I share that with you just as part of, I think, for any methodology in doing this work is you have to think creatively, but how do you motivate people to want to be part of this research? Interestingly for us, for example, for the Olympics, we have actually a massive panel with almost zero churn. And it's interesting just because we've approached it in a way where, hey, be part of this great pioneering work. We're doing this really exciting stuff about measuring how people are consuming media across all these platforms, which you'd like to be part of it. And so we've created excitement about that, which itself is creating its own retention. But it's how do we play with that? And as an industry, how do we always find new ways about which becomes intrinsically motivating? One of the things we've had a lot of discussions with our clients with is how do we better sharing back more of this data back with consumers? Of course, everyone's like, well, is that going to bias their behavior? Personally, I believe it's so hard to get anyone to actually change their behavior. Like, look, yeah, well, yes, I'm going to go to the gym more. I'm definitely going to do that. Right? I'm going to definitely not eat this or do that. Whatever those things are, it's really hard just for us to do that for ourselves, never mind research. But these are the kinds of debates we still need to have. How do we make doing this research itself more rewarding for people? The other big challenge to doing this well is, our good old friend Snowden definitely did not help us in a really fundamental way. People read the terms and conditions of what they sign up to now. A significant number of people actually read what data you're taking. It's surprising to me, and I've seen such a change just in the last 3 years. People really pay attention. So again, this is an important part we find in being really honest with people. We never, never, never want anyone to be surprised about the data we're taking. And so we go to great lengths to explaining plain English all the different data. And fine, if people don't want to participate for that, very good. In fact, this has been an issue, especially when we deploy for example, our home routers, where some people are concerned about us being able to have access to their work emails going through their home Wi-Fi. That sort of issue is a very fair issue, even though we don't care about it, we don't see the content, but the fact that people are caring, they're thinking about that now is a challenge to how do you do this kind of research well? How do you get good data? Because it's on people's minds. And the final part comes down to matching of the data. Just as I explained to you, the own spaghetti plate of data that we have just within measuring one house is a challenge. Then you think about how do you take those data sets? How can we take our finite panels of talking thousands of people? And really the power is how can we amplify that by then doing good matching and lookalike modeling so we can fuse that with large, big data sets. And that helps create more value for everyone's data. That work is still very hard and requires good thinking, good analytics to do well. But as we start to do that, it starts to become interesting stories. And I'm going to show you some illustrative data. This is, I wouldn't even say top line. This is data I presented back to some SIM committee members a few months ago, showing some of the stuff we were seeing about children's behavior. But I'm sharing with you, not because it's right, because more to highlight the challenges that we have in here and some things we ourselves have learned. So for example, one of the biggest challenges is really making sure you attribute time. You can attribute with 100% certainty who was watching what and how. And so for us, for example, you see some things which kind of make sense, right? People more time, having perhaps more time in terms of how they're consuming media on the weekends to watch stuff live than they would during the week. So streaming about the same, some of the thing makes sense, but the biggest challenge is who exactly was watching this stuff. So we had to roll this data up at this point in time because we couldn't with 100% certainty be able to attribute back the viewership to an individual because things like our check-in app just weren't being used well enough. And so the sort of thing of how do we take this from a household to an individual was still the biggest challenge there. Or how can we start to look at being able to break down by platform? And we have like this big other here because the challenge is actually making sure you can correctly identify a piece of programming to a given provider and not just some, just make up a guess on the stuff. Be able to be certain, is it HBO or Netflix or Hulu or whatever, to be certain about that takes great work. So some things are relatively easy, some things harder, and it's that sort of precision that makes it very difficult to do this job well. In the same way, how are people by times, by type of person, how are they consuming media, or how does that get, again, all these things over the course of the day, what's the average by viewing by these children across these different device types. So making sure, one, what exactly is coming from which device type, is it live, is it not live? All of these kinds of things are both the data collection analytics challenges that you have to make sure you get really good data out from here. But we're able to start to build pictures about really seeing things that start to make sense and being able to describe exactly how it is that people are consuming media, how this changes between weekday or weekend, when they use these things, in what context, what's at home, what's out of home. And so you can start to think more specifically about how you're going to really be able to use this data to not just be reaching generically people on mobile or tablet or TV, but actually thinking about where, when best to reach them, what's the context to reach them. And that's what we're starting to do now with all we're working is how do we continue to push forward things to make this data better by doing better jobs on content matching, by making it easier. We have to make everything our panelist does more passive. We think just the more you ask people, the less compliance. It's obvious, but how do you make it fun? How do you gamify the experience? How do you attribute data better to people? And how do you make just the economics of this stuff? Because fundamentally, all of us need this data to do our job well, but it's also still hideously expensive. And it's something which is still a barrier for us to get really good data at the volumes that everybody wants. So that really is, in a little nutshell, sort of a how-to kit on going about collecting and processing cross-media data. Questions?
As you outlined too, like one of the main challenges is organizing all this information. So in terms of like your marketer, data, do you have any recommendations on how you start organizing it now? So I guess the point you actually execute on it, that's ready to do kind of analysis.
I guess there's lots of ways to think about it. From our point of view, the number one thing is how do you think about working from the individual out, and the individual, and then the devices that individual uses, and building out from there. That if you can really identify that a person on a person-by-person basis, that is the most powerful organizing construct. That you can start from household or device or from populations, but you're always left with things that are too vague then, and it's not a strong structure. And that's what we're finding. Many of our clients now are starting to buy respondent level data from us because then they have that bedrock of here is this person, and we have all these demographics and psychographics we can pull against that person, these very specific demographic profiles and their device IDs. And so we can take the device IDs, take all that data and start to lookalikes like that, and out you go. So that very specific data about a person is really, I think, the bedrock of organizing.
So I was interested when you said, you talked about two things about maintaining retention on some of these panels. One was about incentives, but I was really intrigued when you talked about generating excitement. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, is that something new for you guys that you've done? How have you done that? How have you positioned yourselves? In some ways, you're marketing a product to a set of consumers, yes, and you're learning about how to market that, and I'm curious to hear how they think about your service or your relationship with them.
Yeah, it's an even more complex puzzle because in our own way, how do we best motivate people to join this experience? And we're not always front and center in that. So for example, we work with, with SSI, so one of the SSI teams are here. And so you're working with someone like that who has a direct relationship with a large panel that they have. So how do you create these tools which work in partnership? Ourselves, we think about, again, how on a really basic level is how do you first make this so it is frictionless for the consumer, the most basic level. And that in itself has been a major task of how do you just put technology on these devices which doesn't create headaches for them. And that sounds like such an obvious thing, but it's so hard. Just measuring, as we all know, if you put on a map function on your phone, the battery goes like, whoosh, takes it away, right? It goes very quickly. So whenever we're activating any of these kinds of tools, you have to be very efficient in even the burden it puts on a device. So just technically itself is a lot of work. But so then it becomes the parts. So there's very simple things like, again, for the Olympics, part of it is just giving them fun stuff. That's great. That's very basic. some of the things we do see and what we've been keen to do, this is where there's a tension between us and all of our clients and subscriber data, is are we biasing? But we've seen, certainly from experiments we've done, a lot of interest from consumers to actually be able to see some of their own data. How does their behavioral profile fit against that of the population? What does that look like? How can I learn about myself? And that's something which we still want to develop more. It's something where we finally got some of our clients more interested. And interestingly, I know some technology companies have pushed into this area more. Where they had a problem was they were running against their own sort of internal privacy policies for other products, which insisted that consumers be able to do things that put these two policies at odds. So they stopped that just because it wasn't sustainable in terms of having contradictory policies. But what they have found, some of these tech companies that have done this, is that that's a very powerful mechanism for motivating people to stay part of it. So, I think that sharing back of data part is a ripe area still for exploration.
I have one question, Will.
Sure.
Way back at the beginning of your presentation, it was a table or a grid where on the first column was the various platforms, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the context of this question is, right, if I had a penny for the amount of time someone has said to us here at the area, what's this platform for? What's that platform for in terms of the purchase funnel, for want of a better phrase?
Right.
Insofar as you guys are capturing how and why people use individual media in terms of the purchase funnel, I used it for, narrow down my consideration set, or I used it to do product research or whatever. And taking on board your point about, averages being very misleading. Do you have any kind of normative data around what the platforms are used for?
I actually think
that's kind of a how long is a piece of string.
I actually sort of flip it around and say, I think actually the power of the kind of data we have is to actually not have to go into generalizations. In fact, if you really do the work, you see that these different media, according to the kinds of things you're trying to do, actually have really different roles to play. If you actually want to dig into the data yourself, you can really learn that there are really smart things to do to maximize things according to the certain behaviors of different categories. I'll give you just one really simple example, but just some of this works we did for a while ago for a sausage manufacturer, right? So how would an unglamorous category?
It's supposed to be a British client.
No, a U.S. producer, right? So what are you going to do in selling more sausage in the grocery store? And how could they better sell sausage to millennials? And it was like a really kind of a simple thing, but right? But how can that be interesting? Is it really that different? But actually, just one thing I can say off the top of my head is a really big difference is how to activate shoppers in the grocery store. And okay, I'll do a test here, see if anyone, the things which are surprising to me are obvious to you guys. But okay, if you're targeting, what would you think are the two best media choices for a millennial sausage buyer in the supermarket to activate them? And what do you think are the best two media channels to reach an older shopper in the supermarket? Who wants to take a step?
I don't know if it was you or Taylor.
Yeah.
Say that millennials respond better to in-store advertising, and then older people respond better to flyer store.
I did make some reference to that, but what exactly? So I gave some clues earlier about the kinds of things, but what specific kind of in-store advertising do the millennials go for?
It isn't like an ad that pops up in social media, is it?
Not so much. No. Does anyone want to be brave? Main media planners want to take a stab? No, we won't. We're not recording this. It's all safe.
Can we add in tasting it?
Sure. Yeah. What if?
Like samples.
Yeah. That would could be one way. Actually, that I don't think we actually collect that piece of data. So there you go. See, so the challenge is in data collection, right? How do you standardize sampling? I don't think that's.
More data points.
No, but it's okay. This is great. So like, how do you? So, all right, I'll give the answer. So, for the millennials itself, the number one thing, actually, mobile coupons, so location-triggered advertising, very effective. We spend a lot of time on the phones. And also, in-store video displays, really, really pay attention to it. Whereas older shoppers, they're going by those video displays, but totally tune them out, invisible to them, totally invisible. But the good old in-store flyer, the printed copy, yes, and shelf coupons. Shelf coupon, like those little coupon dispenser machines, great for the older shopper. Same environment, right? Totally exactly the same store, but two sets of media responded to completely differently. And it's that kind of detail. It's like, what is going to trigger a sausage shopper? Totally different media. So this is where you have to be very clear on who exactly you're trying to reach and how. You can't stop. If you start this in the abstract, you're doomed, because your media plan will never recognize actually how different we are. And that's the beauty of the data, is you can actually plan for this. If you want to take the time, you can plan for this from the original creative, which is because you think, again, if I'm trying to motivate someone to go buy more sausage at the grocery store, but I understand that kinds of creative I can come with will be vastly different depending on who it is that I'm trying to reach and how, right? So that's the thing where if you actually go back and unpeel this and think about it, I think the power of advertising can be greatly enhanced when people actually make use of this data. I don't think that's done often enough now, and I think for those who can do it, it's a massive advantage. There's a massive opportunity to really think about the subtle ways and how you can change behavior. That's really what this is all about. The data is now there. You can actually quantify what drives behavior. And so if you take and make full advantage of that, it's a huge strategic advantage for those who do.
Thanks, Rolf. Thanks, I'm going to thank Rolf and Taylor. We do have wine and the like outside, so please catch up with them if you have any additional questions, or catch up with us. If you're sitting in the audience and you're wondering, by the way, I'm Mark Rappin. I'm the head of partnership for the ARF. So all of you are in the audience. You're here to what you joined as members for, so that we can give you the latest and greatest content. But if you're sitting there saying, gee, how did Rolf and Taylor get up in front? How do they get their content shared? That's more my job. And also, I just want to point you to what we started last year and we're really activating. And this is part of that process, is we have a 365-day-a-year call for content. So if you have a new study, if you have something that's interesting, if you have something that you want to share, fill out the form. It's pretty easy. It's just a quick synopsis of what you have. It'll go into the call for content. We'll evaluate it and get you in the right event at the right stage at the right time. And if you do it now over the next month or so, that's also when we're doing our evaluation for what's going to be part of Rethink. Rethink is until March, but we do have a lot of upcoming events coming up. We talked about, kind of what led to this. As Jasper mentioned, we did original research that kind of said, okay, a really big kicker event is combining TV and digital, and it's best if you have kind of a unified strategy, but that creative is, created specifically for that medium. Everybody kind of nodded their head, and then about the day after, Jasper got 320 emails. Okay, I believe you. How do I do that? And so the 922 event will be in New York at a theater a little bit on the West Coast, where we'll bring in some agency people and some case studies and folks and talk about how you actually do that.
On the west side, right?
Right. I think it's 7th and 26th. And then if you can get your company to fly you out to San Francisco in November, we'll be talking about mobile on even a greater stage, not just the creative, but how you master mobile in terms of gathering information on mobile devices, how you maximize the spending and ROI on mobile devices, as well as how you master the creative on mobile devices. And we'll be at Facebook's campus in Menlo Park, California. We have 2 Women in Analytic events between now and the end of the year. Those are some of our more popular events. We'll be here in New York on October 13th, down at Havas, and at the beginning of,
That's not typo.
yeah, I was going to say, at the beginning, Havas over there, twice. And we'll also be in Chicago the first week in December. And these are just kind of the highlight of the events. Look on arf.org. Check the news you can use when you could get it. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Daniel or I or your member manager. We're happy to see you here and get you involved as much as possible. So thanks, and thanks again, guys.
Please someone's finish all this wine and all the food. Great, stay as long as you like.
Thank you.